So, as I mentioned, this golden age of the American economy is marked by prosperity across social classes, which meant for the first time that the working class could also be equal participants in what we call consumer culture, or using the purchase of products or the taking of leisure time as kind of an earmark of economic success. More and more products were available to consumers during the 1950s at more affordable prices. Part of this was due to pent up consumer demand. During World War II, remember, a lot of manufacturing had shifted to war materials. And so, even if you wanted to, say, buy a new refrigerator, it just wasn't accessible to you. So, a lot of Americans had built up savings from World War II and hadn't been able to buy consumer products. So as the economy shifts towards making consumer products again, there's now this pent up consumer demand to spend money on consumer goods. But again, the increase of mechanization in manufacturing drops the cost of products even further and makes things like televisions and radios more accessible to the average American. And even if you didn't have enough money to, say, buy that new car, you could buy it on credit. So, credit is not a phenomenon that's new to the 1950s. We've talked about credit in terms of like store credit extending all the way back to the early 1900s. However, the credit card is a new innovation during the 1950s. So, credit cards, still at this point mostly associated with, say, individual store accounts, become more widespread in the 1950s as Americans are more and more comfortable with maintaining a certain level of debt to be able to afford the things they want to buy and live the lifestyle they want to live. This is why, when you look at it today, a lot of American consumers do carry at least some form of debt, usually consumer debt and credit cards, but as we're seeing among younger generations, student loan debt as well. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. American goods are also selling very well, not only at home, but also on the global marketplace. Products like Coca Cola and Levi jeans are marketed abroad to consumers as not only essential items, but also as symbols of America and freedom in the context of the Cold War. So many US manufacturers really kind of lean on the Cold War in their ad campaigns to say, if you participate in this consumer culture and you buy these American products, you're helping to promote capitalism and democracy in the light of the Cold War. We also have this conversation over free enterprise and trying to minimize the amount of regulation of the government in the economy, because again, during a time of Cold War, we really wanted to emphasize how much freedom existed, not just for individuals but also for businesses. So people increasingly talk about capitalism, limited regulation of capitalism, as a hallmark of the United States during the Cold War. Businesses use the Cold War and advertising not only to talk about their products being symbols of America and freedom, but also that Americans had freedom of choice. So, for example, if you go to the grocery store, you don't just have one type of ketchup to choose from, you might have 15 varieties. And today there's a little bit of a pushback against that, right? Because there's so many choices. How do you decide? And many businesses also tie consumption to patriotism. Many businesses do this not only to do their part sort of in the Cold War and there's battle over hearts and minds, but also trying to shed the big business stigma that had plagued businesses during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, and emphasizing just how important participating in capitalism was in the context of the Cold War, that you were doing your part by buying that car or that refrigerator. Businesses push for less government regulation in the economy and weaker unions, who they saw as hampering their ability to run their business as they saw fit. And what's interesting is that businesses pushing this emphasis that the government needs to be hands off in the economy in order for the economy to thrive But as we've mentioned earlier, it's actually government contracts in certain areas of the nation that stimulate uh, economic growth. So, government defense contracts, federally sponsored loans, government subsidies in education do drive a lot of economic growth. So, this notion that the government needs to be hands off for the industry to take off really isn't as true or as applicable when we look at certain areas of the economy that really do benefit from government contracts and loans. One of the technologies that really becomes popular during the 1950s is the television. As I mentioned earlier, the television was invented in the 1920s. It was starting to be manufactured and advertised to consumers in the late 30s, but because of World War II, most consumers don't become aware of television and start buying them until late 40s and 50s. The television at this time, it was introduced, was a way to bring visuals into American homes. Prior to this, Americans had to go to the movies to go to a physical movie theater to be able to see programming that was visual. And at this time, there were only about 3 television stations in the United States that were broadcasting. What's interesting about television is we have this mass purchases of television throughout the 1950s. So by the end of the 1950s, many American households had a television set at home. But when we also look at the types of programming that are popular during the 1950s, it gives us some interesting insight into 50s culture. In particular, if you look at one popular form of television show, the sitcom. So, sitcom is short for situational comedy. You've probably seen a sitcom unless you live under a rock, right? The idea is most of these sitcoms are short, like half-hour long shows, and the protagonists of the show kind of get into some sort of funny dilemma, right? There are jokes, there's humor, there's laughter, sometimes there's a laugh track. And the sitcom as a genre owes its start very heavily to radio shows. A lot of the most successful early television shows were simply successful radio programs that made the jump to television and to a visual medium. So the sitcom in the early 1940s, excuse me, early 1950s represents this shift in that you have one of the most popular early sitcoms is a sitcom called The Goldbergs, not to be confused with the recent ABC show of the same name. The Goldbergs had been a successful radio show about a Jewish family living in an urban city, and it made the jump to television and became popular as well. Another popular early sitcom is The Honeymooners, which again depicted two working class couples living in an apartment building in a city. And as we get to the end of the 1950s, though, the makeup of folks in the sitcom changes. Now, sitcoms towards the end of the 50s, like Leave It to Beaver and The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, depict nuclear families living in the suburbs and belonging to the middle class, where dad has a white collar job, mom stays at home and takes care of the house and the kids. If you've ever watched Leave It to Beaver, June Cleaver is kind of the icon of 1950s housewifery, right? She does her chores, including her vacuuming, fully dressed in like full face of makeup, pearls, dress, heels, right? So the sitcoms towards the end of the 1950s represent less the reality that most Americans are living and instead this ideal that Americans want to live, right? This is kind of the hallmark of American success, that house in the suburbs, only one parent needing to work, relative prosperity. So what's interesting is that looking at sitcoms, we can kind of see this shift, right, to suburbia and to middle class, away from cities and away from working class, like in earlier sitcoms. In advertising, TV ads now kind of change the way that products are marketed. Again, a lot of these early TV ads were translated radio jingles, And for the first time, political campaigns embark on this new medium of television for ads as well. Television ads, again, because there are only three networks, right? You're limited in what you're watching, reach huge swaths of Americans. And many corporations during the 40s and 50s actually go so far as to sponsor TV shows. So, for example, the Colgate Variety Hour, right? Sponsored by Colgate toothpaste. So, this is also an interesting way for advertising agencies and for companies to sell products by using television and television ads. The impact on American culture and American leisure time of television cannot be understated or overstated. Americans now spend a lot of their leisure time watching television, which leads to shifts in viewing habits. For example, there is no TiVo, there's no DVR, there's no, I'm going to watch this tomorrow on my computer on the internet with YouTube. If you wanted to watch a program, you needed to have your butt sit down in front of the TV at the time that program came on, or you would miss it. So a lot of Americans kind of rearrange their schedule to catch their favorite shows. There's no remote controls. So if you were the youngest member of the family, it was your job to get up and change the channel if someone wanted to change the channel. And we also now have the invention of frozen dinners during this time period because you didn't want poor mom stuck in the kitchen while the program was on cooking. So now, for the first time, this idea of frozen meals that you could pop in the oven, because we don't have microwaves quite yet, so that the whole family could sit and eat off of trays while watching their favorite television program. This is invented as a way to, again, facilitate Americans to catch their favorite shows on television.